Okay, well, hello and welcome to Remote, Restricted and Redesigned Funerals in the Time of Coronavirus. My name is Hannah Gould and I'm an ARC Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. And I have the great pleasure to be moderating this conversation today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which I occupy, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge that in this global context of coronavirus uncertainty, and other uncertainties and injustices, that the issues we discuss today will disproportionately affect certain communities, and those communities need to be in the forefront of our minds and our conversations today. So as I said, my name's Hannah and I'll be moderating this conversation. I'm part of the Death Tech research team, which is a team of scholars based at the University of Melbourne who research questions of technology, death and social change. We've been doing so now for near to a decade, and we're very lucky to have many relationships with death practitioners and scholars around the world who are joining me here today. So before I begin, I'll just give some housekeeping. Welcome to all our attendees, and you'll see that you have a chat function available. If you'd like to ask a question throughout the proceedings, please do so by typing it into the chat section. You can either be asked to be by your name and your position or your company, or you can be anonymous if you wish. Please try for single, not five-part questions, and questions that have a question mark at the end, not statements, if possible. You can either direct your questions to a single member of the panel or to the panel in general. And the moderators I have here is Tamara Cohn and Bjorn Nansen, who will be helping me to moderate the conversation and the questions, and they will bring the questions to the panel in the second half of our conversation. So if there's something that you'd like to ask, please put it into the chat. You can also upvote popular questions. Otherwise, if you'd like to continue the conversation from this evening, people will be tweeting using the hashtag #COVIDfunerals. I'll put that in the chat now. And otherwise, if you would like to reach out to us, you can also do so via our website or via email. Okay, so the formal proceedings will try and end a little bit after 7 to 7:30, but hopefully we'll have a fruitful conversation that will continue on after that. So as I'm sure we've all experienced now, COVID-19 pandemic represents a serious threat to human life and livelihoods. But it's also an upheaval for how we die and how we grieve and how we memorialise our loved ones across the globe. Social distancing or social shelter-in-place regulations have upended cultural and religious traditions of mourning by restricting interaction with the deceased, attendance at funerals, and grave visitation at cemeteries. It should be noted from the beginning of this discussion today, as I've said, that these restrictions vary widely by region, and we have at least 3 different continents represented here. And it also varies the impact on different communities, including death care workers, etc. So this forum brings together different people from different backgrounds to think about the implications of these changes and some of the creative responses on new rituals and new technologies that people are using to overcome them or to engage with them. I think this is a really important juncture for us to reflect on these questions. So I'm joined today by 4 death care workers and scholars who are very, very gracious in giving up their time and their resources to take part in this conversation. So we have Mariam Adadi, who's a funeral director, consultant and educator who's based in Sydney. Mariam, if you'd like to say hello, maybe wave hands.
Hello, that's me.
We have Stephanie Longmuir, who is an end-of-life celebrant, a podcaster and consultant based in Melbourne, Australia. Steph, hi, nice to have you.
Hi.
Hi. We have Dr. John Troyer, who is the Director of the Centre in Death and Society, the University of Bath, UK, who was very kindly joining us from the wee hours of the morning from Wisconsin, I believe, 3 a.m. Hi, John.
Yeah, that's correct. Hi. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you very much. And we have Louise Winter, a funeral director and founder of Poetic Endings, which is a modern funeral company based in London. Hi, Louise.
Good morning. Hi.
Very beautiful sunny scenes behind you there in London.
I know, it's beautiful.
Excellent. So we'll start off the questions. As I said again, For attendees, if you have any questions that arise throughout our conversation, please do type them into the chat. You obviously won't be able to speak them out loud, but we'll have that as the second part of our conversation. And for the 4 panelists, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So we're actually going to start out with a question for Louise. And I'd like to ask you, I know we kind of connected over Twitter and your kind of musings on the experience of being a funeral director in the middle of COVID in London. So as working in that situation, how do you feel that the sector has navigated these public health restrictions and responded to public expectations around funerals and grief and mourning?
So, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here today. So I was reflecting this morning on my way to work, how much has changed and how much of a journey we've been on over the last few months. Everything right now feels quite calm. The death rate is much lower than it was at the peak, and we've really got into the rhythm of how the new way of doing funerals works. And it would be quite easy to forget everything that we've been through over the last few months, especially at the beginning of COVID, when I was tweeting every morning. I think I would wake up and write something like, this is a reality that I've woken up to this morning, and then write something about how PPE, the price of PPE had tripled overnight, or we were having to have difficult conversations with people about the changing expectations around funerals and what the government were about to announce, or suddenly our florists were closed and no one could get hold of flowers for funerals. So all of that was happening very quickly, and we had to respond really urgently. We were a few weeks behind Italy in the UK, and we were watching what was happening there, where the funeral system was really falling apart. And I think that funerals were pretty much banned altogether. I don't think people were allowed to attend. And we were in this limbo of anticipating whether that was going to happen here. We could see that the death rate was increasing. We were having an increasing number of people coming into our care with COVID, and the government was giving us very little advice at the time. So we were stuck in this sort of no man's land of waiting for an announcement, trying to manage the expectations of the people we were working with who had arranged funerals in a very different context, especially when the deaths had nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. And they were often funerals that would have been attended by potentially hundreds of people. And we were beginning to see that numbers in attendance were dropping. People were saying that they wouldn't be attending because someone in the family was vulnerable, or because of travel restrictions from other countries. So we were seeing funerals getting smaller and smaller anyway. And I think that was the most difficult part of the whole pandemic, was anticipating what was coming next. We were wondering whether there would be a ban on funerals, and every day was waking up and we would have families on the phone all the time saying, has Boris Johnson, who's our Prime Minister, banned funerals yet? Is my daughter's funeral still going ahead? So that was one of the really early challenges. And then eventually we did get an answer, which was that the government was going to restrict attendance at funerals to immediate family only, which meant that the sector was stuck with having to create their own directives really about what it was going to look like. And in most cases, that meant that cemeteries and crematoria restricted the number of people in attendance according to the size of their chapel and what was safe, what was a safe number for them to have in the chapel. And so overnight, we became sort of the funeral police, because the government guidance was so vague at best. It was over to us to try to patrol it, to try to get the people we were working with to understand and not to break the restrictions, so that we could keep everyone safe. The other thing that happened here is that the funeral system didn't break. And I think the reason for that was because we have what's called local resilience forums, and they are groups of people, the police, the military, fire brigades, local councils, they're all involved in managing a response to an emergency. And we were seeing scenes in Italy with the army having to step in to take over funerals, and the army trucks taking away all the people who had died. And it just didn't happen here. And the reason was because our funeral system is much more resilient. It's actually much more commercial and corporate than the system in Italy. And the two breaking points were storage, so funeral directors running out of space, and also crematorium and cemeteries capacity. And to address those issues, the local resilience forums built temporary mortuaries at great expense. It costs about 1.8 million to build a temporary mortuary, and then hundreds of thousands of pounds a week to keep it running. But because those temporary mortuaries were built, it meant that we didn't have to have, sort of 30 cremations that were unattended going on every day, and that funerals could stay attended and people could actually have a meaningful farewell in some respects. So although we saw fewer people attending and people having to be very restrictive about what they were allowed to do and having to tell people not to touch the coffin and not to sit in various pews because we had to keep everyone apart. In the UK, we still managed to go ahead with funerals. And actually, out of that, there have been some really amazing experiences. I think people were imagining that the funerals would be incredibly sterile, that they would be really bland and really meaningless. And actually what's happened is some people have found incredible meaning in the fact that they're so small. And you may only have 20 minutes to say goodbye, but you can make those 20 minutes really incredibly meaningful and relevant, and people have got a lot from it. And I think that's what I would take away from the experiences we've gone through. And I love that the words that you used to describe this, remote, restricted and redefined. I'd also add resilient and resourceful.
Yeah.
And we've seen resilience from so many funeral directors who have really helped people to have some control at a time when all control has been taken from them, and find micro ways to bring some meaning back to the funeral. But also from the families and the friends themselves as well, who have managed to find meaning in those really restricted funerals and done it so gracefully as well. And with gratitude. Most of them have been really grateful to actually have been allowed to attend the funeral at all.
Yes, it's an extraordinary testimony. I mean, it's a very different situation, as we said, in the central London as it is from different parts around the world. But I think we're gonna get into the funerals and what kind of funerals have kind of taken shape in the next little part. But I wonder if anyone else on the panel had an experience or a feeling of this amazing phrase you used, the funeral police, or finding themselves in a position of having to be an advocate of government restrictions, or how you've had to navigate that with families. Stephanie, you're nodding your head. Do you want to add on that?
Very much so. I mean, in the, when lockdown started here on the 31st of March, we went down to 10 funeral services, and we had to turn people away. When people turned up and there were more than 10, we had to turn people away. And, most people understood, but for grandchildren and things like that, that became quite tricky. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was extraordinarily difficult to kind of represent that to grieving families in particular, and to have yourself put in that position and have to deal with the uncertainty of what the changing restrictions are, I suppose.
And, people were trying to be creative to get around it. I had one family I did at the service for, and we had the 10 family members there, and then the other 10 wanted to line the street and do a guard of honour. But we couldn't even allow that because, again, it was a gathering, and, so we had to say no. So, yeah, we did become the funeral police.
What an extraordinary position. Mariam, did you have any experience of that yourself, or having to?
We again saw some families becoming really with a community that comes from a very large family. Some of them live with second and third generation relatives, kind of intergenerational relatives, kind of there with grandmother, sometimes great grandma, grandmother, and then parents, and then having to say only 10. And in the beginning, I think it was different for different states. 10 could be 10 family, or it could be 10 family and funeral workers plus clergy and imams. So trying to work out who was the 10 was really difficult. But yeah, we ended up being marshals as well. We had to stand at a point and then allow 2 in, and then 2 would exit, and then 3 would come in and 3 would exit, just so that we can keep the 10 inside. So we definitely had to assume the same position.
Wow. Yes, it's certainly an extraordinary position to suddenly be thrown into, given that that's your primary, I suppose, obligation is towards the families and towards the deceased, and not really towards these kind of restrictions that you're asked to interpret. Wow, so we might talk about what kind of freedom could be found in those restrictions, and how people have have tried to find creative and, as you said, resilient and resourceful responses, because I think a lot of the media coverage certainly initially was about restrictions and you kind of what's been bad about these kind of implications for funerals. But I know, talking to some of you, that there has been room for freedom and creativity. So Stephanie, I wanted to direct a question at you as a celebrant, in talking to bereaved families to in Australia to design services. I wonder what kind of choices the families made in response to those restrictions, and are there any choices that surprised you that you didn't think would come out of COVID?
So I think the most surprising thing, and Louise, I mean, obviously our experiences are very different, but there's a huge commonality, was I was very surprised at how much families got out of that small, intimate service. And in fact, all of my families, and because for a period of 8 weeks, we were doing services for 10 people only. And in that first week, I had one family cancel a service because they had wanted the big service. So they thought they'll do a memorial service down the track, and that was fine. But the other families, people just jumped on board so quickly and adapted so quickly. And I mean, the other thing that I've been really impressed with is how quickly, you know, the funeral profession, which is a profession that is steeped in tradition, just jumped into the 21st century. And, you know, we were live streaming services, and we would, you know, Zooming family meetings, and, you know, that things just changed so quickly. But I think that, you know, just coming back to that intimacy of the smaller service, families made enormous effort around the service because they knew that it could only be 10 people there. And, you know, maybe we only had 10 people there and we had 200 others live streaming. But those 10 people there put in so much effort and became so creative. There's one service that I did, and it was for a young woman. She was in her 40s and she died of cancer. And her daughter was an artist. She took the lid of the coffin home and decorated that. The mother collected shells that, you know, to place in the grave. You know, the father baked shortbread because that was her favourite thing. Her brother, you know, made a temporary headstone out of wood for the burial. You know, there were all these things, and everyone in the family did something really creative to make that funeral really meaningful, because for them, you know, it wasn't going to be that perfect service of, you know, 400 or 500 people. So what they could do, they did really well. And I think, you know, on the day they came away and said that they got an enormous amount out of that service, because while there were only 10 people in the room, there were 287 people that live streamed, and, you know, they could have their intimate family moment, knowing that they were supported widely by, you know, a greater group, but not having that overwhelming sense of hundreds of people there on the day. So for a lot of people, they, you know, they made the best of it. I guess the other thing, as I said, that surprised me, I had one family who had decided to do a memorial service, and, you know, there were family in France and in Sydney and grandchildren all over the place, and so they decided, you know, they'd do the memorial service down the track. But the one son really wanted to be able to say, he was the only son in Melbourne, to say goodbye to his mother. And so my wonderful funeral director said, well, you know, tell me about your mother. And we started talking about her. And he said, you know, my mother, you know, when I was young, I was really sporty. She drove me everywhere. He said, take the hearse. We'll load the hearse up for you. Steph, you sit in the front, you know. And so he got to drive his mother out to the crematorium and drop her off. And, you know, even though it wasn't the big service that they had imagined, he got to do that one last thing for her. And that was really important. So everybody has, I think, you know, I think all of us over the last 3 months have never worked so hard, because there's been so little that we can do for our families, that we've just wanted to make what we can do so much better. So we've kind of found creative ways to do things. And yeah, it's been a really, really interesting time.
Wonderful. Does anyone else on the panel have a similar story of a creative redesign or get around for a ceremony?
Yeah, actually, I think what's come out of this is how important funerals are, and how people were unwilling to let them go, even though they were having to face all these constraints and challenges. And I found that out of every constraint has come a creative solution. So I think flowers have been an amazing one. When we went into lockdown and all the florists closed and the flower markets closed, it became really difficult for our florists to get flowers at all. And so people were having to go to supermarkets because somehow the supermarkets could still get flowers. And then come up with trying to get lots of flowers from Tesco and make them look really beautiful to be able to place on the coffin. I think one of the most amazing things that came out of this is the power of community. We had a family who didn't want to have supermarket flowers, and instead asked all of their neighbours, most of whom they don't actually know, they just have a sort of community WhatsApp group. But they announced that the person had died, and then asked that everyone could cut flowers and foliage from their garden and just leave it on their doorstep on the morning of the funeral. And they did, and they attached it all to some hessian, and that was placed on the coffin, and it ended up being one of the most beautiful arrangements of flowers I had ever seen, and even more meaningful because it came from that community spirit of we're all in this together and we're all finding a way through this. And if it wasn't for COVID, I don't think that funeral would have had quite that same community element to it. The whole street wouldn't have come together in the same way that it did to acknowledge that someone from the street had died. And it was really beautiful to see how even strangers were caring for people that they didn't necessarily know.
Yeah, sorry, that's wonderful. I wonder then if there's, sometimes we feel there's a bit of a hesitancy that people have around funerals when someone dies, what to do, how to help, that sort of thing. I wonder if any of you, if John or Mariam, if you see this kind of community grassroots movement is potentially changing how people interact with funeral directors and funeral homes. Perhaps it's a little bit too early to tell, but it is maybe one of the things that we get out of this situation is that people find more and more DIY solutions to funerals and have a bit more freedom to imagine what a funeral could be, perhaps.
Yeah, I think in particular, because we are slowly moving away, in particular in Australia, we are slowly moving away from the commercialized model of death and how we do death and funerals. So I think I don't like to say I capitalized on it, but I really did love the fact that people were open now to doing death differently. And this was music to my ears. As a death literacy advocate, we're always talking to people about becoming more involved in a way that suits them and that's in line with their values and doesn't really have to fit the way that funerals have always been done. And I think this was a great opportunity to have those conversations, to get people talking about planning for end of life and their funeral would look like, and not necessarily be confined to the way things are usually done. So it was definitely the best time to do that.
And I think we can't really go past a conversation of funerals under COVID without having a bit of a discussion about live streaming and Zoom and all its joys and challenges and problems. John, you've just published a book about death and technology, or technology in the human corpse. Zoom perhaps being a little bit further away than most technologies you're writing about. But I wonder if you can see this pattern of kind of innovation of technologies or new technologies being introduced when all of a sudden we're forced to adopt them, and that's really how they become part of the new normal. I mean, I know Zoom and live streaming have been around for quite a while for funerals, but we haven't really needed to adopt them mainstream, and a lot of funeral homes have now been forced to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I want to defer to my colleagues who are working, in the field, as it were, but particularly with funerals. And I should say, and I can't believe I haven't already said this because it's usually like 2 seconds out of my mouth. That my dad was a funeral director, so I grew up in the industry here in the States. Actually, I'm in my hometown right now. I came here to help my parents with some medical issues. They're fine, but I ended up getting marooned in my hometown, suddenly living with my parents again, but which is fine. But I think that the answer to your question, I think that the role of technology in the plural, so technologies, is crucial here. And one thing I would say in regards to the what we can describe as the COVID-19 funeral. We'll just call it that for right now. We don't know what it's going to be called because we're in the middle of it. It could end up being called something entirely different, but we'll just call it the COVID-19 funeral for right now. Is that I do find resonances, there are differences, but resonances with some of the changes that occurred in the 80s and 90s with HIV/AIDS funerals. And I think that as another pandemic, which is still happening, and I think we need to acknowledge that AIDS hasn't disappeared, but it is an example of an epidemic, a pandemic that has itself unfortunately become normalized in a way. But that there were significant changes to funerals that occurred both at the level of concerns around the dead body, but also just like non-traditional celebrations of life, in part because of the restrictions of who was allowed to come, oftentimes just around kind of what we would describe as blatant homophobia on the parts of families. But also too, just a rejection of like what was seen as being, pretty, heteronormative, stodgy, funeral customs and da-da-da-da. My point is simply to say this, that so one of the innovations that comes out of the 80s and 90s that then gets picked up in funerals right away are, camcorders and VCRs and the idea of videotaping the funeral. And, the videotape funeral became that one thing that people who were excluded from going to the funeral could then watch at a later date, or they couldn't attend, even though, of course, the camcorder was never, purposefully created in order to record a funeral. But it becomes used in that way, but also then becomes used in a way to create video montages. There's the whole genre of the person sort of growing up through life. For those who are old enough to remember, like the morphing technology explosion, where you could watch the person sort of slow fade into one, over the years, the sort of the memorial video. Anyway, so I think as we sit today in the middle again of these funerals around COVID-19, and we find the available video technologies, for example, the video platforms being used, I think that should come as a little surprise, because if there's one thing you can say about humans and communication technology and funerals, it's that we have always used what is available, whether it's early photography or the telegraph line, or you can even I would even describe the sort of the development and then use of embalming more in the American context, but it then goes globally. I would put that into a kind of visual communication technology, but all those technologies, just we use what we've got, like we use what's at our disposal, and generally, by and large, quite frankly, in looking over how a lot of these technologies get used, most families are okay with it. Like there's some resistance, but people adapt. Like it's not, but then what I find striking is and then it's completely forgotten about. So that somehow when there's this moment when we're using this new technology, it seems like, oh, will people do that? I'm like, well, yeah, I think they will. I mean, I think if what you're saying is we have to use this tool because it will make the funeral possible, then I think what Stephanie and Louise and Miriam have all said is, and families will do that. I mean, they'll adapt. Like it's not, it's not as if somehow the introduction of technology as a thing to a funeral will suddenly make the funeral something it's not supposed to be. But there is a resistance, I think. And I think that in the world of death and technology, any introduction of new technology is met with a kind of resistance, usually from people not in funerals. It's usually met from resistance from people like commenting on it, like somehow this is going to be a terrible thing. And by and large, they come and go.
It's interesting then, because we seem to be in that period, as you say, of webinars becoming mainstream, Zoom becoming mainstream, of streaming becoming mainstream for funerals. And I wondered for any of those, the three of you working on the ground as you were in the funerals, have you had experiences of families declining to use live streaming, using live streaming in ways you didn't expect, or perhaps really embracing live streaming and not seeing it as an issue? I just wonder what the kind of range of emotions people have towards that technology are.
I think that all of my families have been, I've only done one funeral service in the last 3 months that hasn't been live streamed. And early on, I got some really interesting feedback from a live stream service, and it felt for those watching. And I think, you know, we're so invested in our families and making sure that our families are happy. Sometimes we don't think about what's happening, you know, with the people that are actually watching that live stream and how they're feeling. So I got this really interesting feedback early on, and I then decided to try and make my live stream a little bit more interactive. And where I could, I would try and set up a Zoom camera, a Zoom meeting for family members who couldn't be there, important family members. So it was a little bit more two-way. So before the service, you know, family could talk to each other and kind of set the scene a little bit. And then they were kind of more in the room. And then, of course, then we had the live streaming. But even with the live streaming, I made a huge effort to name people and single them out and try and bring them into the room, because otherwise I just felt like it was a very static thing. You know, it was just, you know, sit down and watch the live stream. You know, there are other things that we were doing with sensory things, with food, sending out messages saying, you know, make sure you have a cup of tea beside you before, you know, you start the service, because this is what, you know, so-and-so would have wanted, or a drink or whatever it was, just to try and tap into another experience for them.
We've had really mixed experiences of streaming funerals. Most of the crematoria in England have got webcams at the back of the chapel. They're fixed webcams provided by the two systems that provide all the music services, but they're quite low quality, and they were never designed to be streaming 12 services a day, 7 days a week. They were used occasionally for someone who was probably abroad and couldn't attend. And overnight, they went from that situation to suddenly having to stream all services, basically, from all crematoria everywhere, and the systems just couldn't cope. And I think we'd really struggled with managing people's expectations over the quality of the webcast that was available. And early on, there were so many problems with crematoria staff not knowing how to even work them. People were logging in and watching someone else's funeral. People were having trouble because the internet at the crematoria was often really low quality, so they wouldn't stream properly. They were being interrupted all the time. And then we would get some complaints such as, oh, but the camera didn't focus on the widow. Why didn't it show more of him, kind of thing? Things that we had no control over. And the way we got around that was by being very realistic at the very beginning of the conversations we were having with the people we were working with about what the experience of the webcasting available at the crematorium was like, so that they didn't have unrealistic expectations. And we do actually have a videographer who specializes in live streaming. So if they were willing to pay extra, he could come along and properly live stream the service with a moving camera, a much higher quality. And people who really couldn't be there, and there were lots of people who wanted to attend, or they wanted to have a permanent record of the funeral, that so they didn't miss anything, usually went for that option. But we've had really mixed experiences, and actually one of the most stressful things about being a funeral director during this time has been arriving at the crematorium and hoping that the system is working on time and that the previous funeral hasn't overrun. Because if the funeral was booked at 2:30, the webcams came on at 2:25 and started streaming regardless of what was going on, in some cases. So it hasn't been a smooth process, and I don't think it has been the overall solution that the sort of media has made out. It's been full of problems, and it's really not really fit for purpose. If we're going to have to keep this system for the foreseeable future, it's going to need to improve quite quickly.
So I think my services had outside videographers. That's how we got around it. So we brought in professional people and had it done properly. We didn't rely on, you know, chapel facilities often.
I think that's a really great comment to say that it's not a band-aid solution. As you said, you know, you can't simply replace the experience of death and grief and mourning with a live stream, particularly if the facilities aren't built for purpose. And it's interesting that a bad live stream is almost worse than no live stream at all, or no, you know, that when that technology breaks down, it can be really a huge problem. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about next, and I think this is a great transition, is how interactions with the body themselves have changed. I think it's really fascinating, and a comparison I hadn't heard before, John, about HIV/AIDS funerals and the same kind of uncertainty about interactions with the body. Because I know that that's one of the things in different situations, different countries around the world, that people haven't been able to view or wash or dress or touch the dead. And that particularly affects different communities for whom that might be more or less important. So Mariam, if I can direct the next question at you, I wanted to know, how have the COVID restrictions affected people's interactions in your experience with the body, whether at the funeral or burial or before or after, and what you think some of the ongoing implications of that might be?
So I think I'd start off just by saying, in your intro, you mentioned that our Indigenous brothers and sisters are adversely affected by a lot of the changes that have happened through COVID, least of all but through funerals. And I was speaking to a local a consumer consultative group that I sit on, and they were most affected by the fact that these are communal events. So the ceremony and the service that happens around the burial is very much a communal event, and it's so similar with the Muslim tradition. So Islamic traditions be afforded 4 rites, the first being a ritual bath, and then the second being a shrouding, the third being a communal, being the burial. And at every stage of those rites, there were interruptions or changes or modifications that had to be made. In the beginning, and I guess this is speaking to a bit of what Louise said, there was a lot of conflicting information. Does COVID-19 sit as part of a prescribed list of infectious diseases? Is it treated differently? Is it the same? Initially, a lot of the information coming out of the WHO and even the CDC was saying minimal post-mortem risk, just standard PPE is fine. And then a lot of that changed at a local level, where it was like, no, it's got to be masks, it's got to be gloves, it's got to be goggles. And a lot of funeral services were left thinking, we don't have all of that, now what? And industry as a whole was really struggling with what was termed standard PPE, and that did change over time. So when families are supposed to come in and be part of the washing and the shrouding, and they're not even allowed to open a body bag, now that's going to cause interruption to that natural grieving process. And what people tend to do when they are going through a death is they try to hold on to what's stable, what's known, what's familiar. And that's those traditions that they usually seek comfort in. So when they also have to change, then the interruptions are felt a lot deeper than what we first anticipated. So when families couldn't come in and perform the washing, and they weren't even allowed to open a body bag, that then thinking, well, is that really mum? Did they really bury mum? Maybe they got the wrong body. Maybe it was somebody different. So we had to think of to allow families into that space. And when I was speaking on a national level with some funeral directors, not many had COVID deaths, but they were treating even suspected COVID patients or patients coming from hospitals that were suspected as confirmed cases. And I guess there's some logic to that, but it ended up being a lot of strict processes that were put in place where families felt largely disconnected. Our funerals happened pretty quickly. So it meant that live streaming, which usually takes a bit of time to set up and invitations to be sent, really wasn't something that was taken up very quickly. Most we got was a few videos that were maybe taken and then shared in family groups on WhatsApp chats and the like. But the members to A, not be present because of the restrictions, and B, not be part of that washing and the shrouding. And that in and of itself was one of the ways that people helped come to terms with their loss, to be able to touch and hold and feel that their person had changed, and that that the death had become real, was it's always been a way that people have been able to work through. So when they're not able to do that anymore, it really ends up a very complicated experience. And we've already seen families that are still saying you know, maybe that didn't happen. It was a dream. You know, it happened too quickly. And then there was also some confusion around it's 10 people that can enter, but then who is allowed to actually come in to that very sacred space where the washing and the shrouding takes place, taking turns. And then the areas that we perform the washing in are generally quite small and tight, so you couldn't really stick to that 4 square meter rule. That would mean only one person was allowed in. So if someone had 4 daughters, you know, the process took a lot longer than what it should have. So it really did. It interrupted the funeral process from start to finish. And then as a byproduct of that, it interrupted the grieving process as well. So yeah, I think there were some rather creative ways that people were still able to connect with the deceased if they couldn't touch or hold. And one of those ways was part of the ritual of the shrouding is to perfume the shroud. So what we were doing was we were giving smaller bottles of perfume so that whatever they used on the shroud, they could then take home with them. And they could then use that as a very sensory way of remembering their loved one. So there were a few things that we could have changed, but it really was quite a dramatic change to the way things normally take place.
Yeah, I mean, that's extraordinary, again, to think of how the different ways of interacting with the body are really affected in drastically different degrees. It's interesting that you bring up sensory at the end there, because I think, Steph, you had a comment as well about finding sensory ways of connecting with the deceased or with funerals that kind of overcome or augment the very visual and auditory experience of streaming, and that sensory kind of new kind of rituals might be a way to find that intimacy. Yeah, really interesting. Did any of the other panelists who've had experiences with handling bodies in this period or interacting with bodies had something to say about it?
Yeah, some of the most difficult conversations we had to have were around the peak of COVID in London. We had 90% of people in our care confirmed who had died with COVID. So it was really, really high. And the 10% that weren't, it was debatable as to whether COVID was involved. They just hadn't been tested. So we had to treat everyone as though they were COVID. And the government was providing very vague guidance, which kept changing and went from super high PPE requirements to very little and then back up again. It was very strange. It was very confusing, and it was hard to know who to trust. And we were hearing varied accounts of how long COVID lives after death. Someone was swabbed 9 days after death and still tested positive. So we were really cautious as funeral directors. A lot of my colleagues weren't, because it would be bad for business. So they continued as usual, but we were really cautious and we put safety first. And some of the most difficult conversations we had were around having to say no and be really firm about saying no. And that was really difficult when, in most cases, people had become ill at home, had gone off in an ambulance because they couldn't breathe, but it was sort of very unclear, and then they had died with no one there. And their family hadn't been able to be at the hospital. They hadn't really had any contact with them. And suddenly they were having to deal with the funeral directors who were saying, no, you can't come and see him. And we can't open the body bags. At the time, during the peak, it was very strict about not opening body bags. And so we just had to say no to absolutely everything. And when people died at home, we were having to be really strict upon the first call of saying, I need you to understand that this is the last time you're going to be able to see your dad, for example, and have some time now and say goodbye. And if you want to dress him, then you need to do it now, because there's not going to be another opportunity later on. And as time has gone on, and we've learned more about how the virus is behaving, and it's become apparent that the whole funeral industry did not come down overnight with COVID because they had been handling the dead. Actually, it seems like most people have been okay. That has changed, but I really do feel for those people, especially around the peak, who all the things that they were articulating they wanted and needed to do, we had to be a barrier and say no, and be really firm in our belief that it wasn't the safe thing for us to do as a team, but also for them to do, especially because PPE was so scarce. And the amount of deaths was so high, and the infection rate in London was so high at the time.
Yeah, that notion
I
of...
wonder what effect that's going to have later down the line. I know after a particular burial for someone who died from COVID, we've had several calls from their family since, wanting us to talk through the whole process from the moment he died up until he came into our care, and then we took him to the cemetery, because they just could not believe that he had really died and that it was him in the ground. And they've needed quite a lot of reassurance from us that it really was him and that this has really happened, just to be able to accept it before they can even get on with breathing.
Yeah, there's extraordinary implications for going forward, and particularly for that idea of not being able to touch, but also just not being able to see who it is to confirm the identity, which is, I think, a fear that goes back really far, you know, in people's interactions with death and funerals, and but also, as you mentioned, the kind of the difficulties that funeral directors around the world have faced, particularly, I know in the UK, but in other areas, of accessing PPE and getting adequate PPE supplies. And I wonder, John, if there's something that could be said about how funeral directors are positioned in relationship to the government, and how, whether or not they get involved or included in these conversations about pandemics and about planning, either in the UK or elsewhere, where their need for PPE is not necessarily recognised as top of the list as compared to other hospitals, for example.
I wanted to say one thing just very quickly too about I think again the history of AIDS is I think important here for the funeral industry, but also funerals, because there was widespread confusion, if not outright panic, around what I think you can call the HIV/AIDS corpse, and this idea that it was this body that was almost radioactive in terms of no one could touch it or what. And that just had a lot to do with like a lack of research or understanding of the virus itself. And that specifically with HIV, and HIV is a retrovirus, so it's different than a coronavirus. So we're talking about different viruses here. And I want to be very clear about that. They're not, you know, you can't go sort of like for like, but that there were numerous rules put forward in the 80s and 90s. And this is, I mean, I'm more familiar with the American literature on this because it was rampant through the funeral industry, but also you find in other countries that there no touching of the body was contagious. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do that with it. So there's that. And I have a feeling, it's just a hunch, so this is always, you know, very hunchy. So, you know, keep that in mind, that I think in the long run, as more research is done around contagion, COVID-19, and the sort of the post-mortem conditions of the virus, I think if other viruses have played out the same way, it may turn out that the dead body itself is not the major carrier concern. It's the living mourners around and so that's the key distinction here, where what we have to be really concerned about are the living mourners being carriers of the virus itself. And so that is different, but of course the dead body becomes the scariest part of it. And I'm saying scary, you know, in quotes, that it becomes the thing. Well, clearly there must be something abject with it because it's a dead body. And I'm just not, and I get that, I understand that. I wasn't surprised that that's sort of the way the narrative took place, but I think ultimately it's going to be about, you know, the living mourners being the ones who carry the virus itself. But we're in the middle of this, so it'll be easier retrospectively to see it, but we're in the middle of it as it plays out. As far as it goes, funeral directors and governance in different countries and rules, I mean, yeah, absolutely, funeral directors should be involved in pandemic response planning. But they are. I mean, and Louise has already referred to this. I know the UK case in my own way through the local resiliency forums, but also just in terms of how governments respond to pandemic response plans. And I can tell you, as someone who worked on pandemic response plans, and what I would what I would call mass fatality events. I think the big cities, particularly London and New York, they have been experiencing mass fatality events. That would be the language I would use, and I think those are the protocols we should be following. That stuff was gamed out. It was written out. Like, these reports were on the shelf, and as to why they weren't followed, that's going to become a bigger ongoing question. And I can't speak for all countries. I can only speak for the countries I know. But I know in the US, so for example, in America, when the Department of Homeland Security was formed way back in the olden days of the early 2000s, one of the first things that the George W. Bush administration did was work on pandemic responses. And there was this move that got made, and I won't go too far into the weeds on this, where there was this just sort of assumption that American funeral directors would just do their job in a pandemic response situation, to which the National Funeral Director Association in this country was like, what are you talking about? Why would we not just take off with our families if it's truly a pandemic? And the government was like, well, because that's what you do. That's your job. You're the funeral directors. And they're like, whoa, we got to be more involved in what's going on here. And so they were, and there were guidelines that came out of that, but then why none of that seemed to have been really followed, I don't know. I mean, no one seems to know. But I do think that, as many of us would know who work around death and dying, the funeral, the dead body, all of it does tend to become an afterthought. And it does tend to be kind of, and this is true within the medical world. I speak kindly of, I have much respect for my brothers and sisters in the medical side of it. But, once the person is dead, they're out, like they're gone. Like, they're like, that's not my job anymore, which I understand, I get, with the exception of pathologists. All respect to pathologists, but I think that there are all these protocols, for example, that come out of AIDS around universal precautions, around PPE, and in the book I just wrote, you mentioned, I'm only going to mention it this way because I think it's funny. In the section on AIDS, I actually say what the PPE acronym stands for because you needed to until recently. I was like, PPE and then brackets, personal protective equipment, because no one's going to know what that is. Like, no one will know what that is. But now, of course, everybody knows what that is.
2020.
Yeah, I know, we've seen that shift. So I think that the answer is, yeah, funeral directors should, of course, be involved in these things. But also in the UK and the US case, they have been. But then, all those plans are only as good as the policymakers who follow them.
Yeah.
And that just hasn't been the case. And I think that will be, we're gonna, in the UK, Louise will know this as well as anyone, we're in the middle of, is it time to ask the probing questions about what's going on? To which my answer is, hell yes, it's time, because this is not going away. We should be doing this right now. However, then you'll get into the political resistance to these questions. And that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, and I think all funeral directors should advocate for these positions and get involved in those mechanisms, because they're like, this is how it's going to work. You've got this plan. I can tell you that part's just not going to work. But and that's why the people who work in these areas need to be listened to in that way, I think. So
before I thank you, John, for the comment. Definitely on the PPE is quite hilarious, actually, because it's the year that we learn many acronyms, PPE included. But before we turn to that difficult question of the future, and I ask a scholar to predict the future, which I know is always a scary event, I just wondered if anyone else on the panel had any reflection on PPE or interacting with bodies in their work, or how families have done so.
I think that the saddest stories that I've heard have really come from families leading up to the death, and access to palliative care facilities and aged care facilities and lack of access. So the stories that I was hearing from families was how distressing it was not having contact and access, not so much, after the event, but before the event.
Mm. So
I think I just wanted to add to John's point. Sorry, Hannah, just about the about funeral directors having a say in this kind of pandemic planning. We very early on, I contacted my local public health unit, and I actually said, as funeral, as registered mortuaries in the local public health districts, shouldn't we all be aware of each other's capacity in case we needed to, did end up like the UK or the US? And that suggestion was actually taken quite seriously. And in the end, we did have very regular discussions with unit. Industry became involved, independent funeral directors, advisors for different faith groups also came together, and we regularly each other. And I do believe that from that, an emergency review of the Public Health Act did take place. So it was something that I didn't think would happen, but I was really grateful for the fact that that was taken up and the suggestions was kind of respected. What I did want to note is on the issue of PPE, funeral directors, to my knowledge, were not, or funeral services were not classified as essential services, which I thought was really weird, given that we did need to play a very important role in what happens after a COVID death. And therefore we weren't prioritized when it came to PPE. So that's where I think there needs to be a lot more work done. I cannot understand why a funeral service wouldn't be classified as an essential service in a pandemic.
Here. Frankly, yeah. Right, so I'm gonna give the last question now for the panelists, for John, and just perhaps in the meantime, if any of the attendees have some questions that they'd like to ask the panel, either individually or panelists overall, now would be a time to have a think and to type them into the chat. But John, I know it's a slightly difficult question for a scholar to answer, but thinking towards the future and coming out of COVID-19, we hope, at least in some stage, if not a second wave, a bit of uncertainty there in my question already. What death care practices, what changes, if any, do you think might persist into a post-pandemic new normal? Is such a thing, understanding that we're all mixed up at the moment, we're not quite sure, but is there anything that you've seen change that you think has some stick to it, that it's going to linger on? It's a very difficult question.
Yeah, no, I know it's a great question there, and it's one I think about. So what I would say is I think everything will stay, everything will be used until it's replaced by something new. By which I mean there will be things that will be of the moment that get picked up now, and tools that are used because they are necessary or what are available. But then there will be things that suddenly we'll discover are not necessarily what we want to use. And I think the example Louise used of crematoria being wired, but very poorly for different kinds of, for example, broadcasting capability, right? So that's a tool people want to use right now, but it's just not set up to do that. So they're going to have to figure out a different way to do it. And that might just be bringing in or having some other kind of, private videographer kind of person. What I'm saying is that these things will, so I think that they're going to continue. So one example I'll just use very quickly would be one thing that comes out of the AIDS epidemic in the US experience of it is a sudden interest in cremation that had not been there before. And that was both interest in cremation, that was both initially almost required, if not outright just done by the funeral industry, because they didn't want to, many funeral directors didn't want to touch AIDS bodies, but also just became seen as something that was a non-traditional kind of service. And I think that it's not a quid pro quo, like cremation suddenly becomes a big thing in America, because it hasn't been, but it suddenly became a thing in America that it hadn't been before, precisely because you had these situations that were created by a new disease or a new epidemic that just changed the rules or changed what the expectations were. So I think that as far as COVID-19 goes, we will see changes, and what will be interesting will be to note how many of them become absorbed into what we think of as the funeral, and we won't realize that they were caused by COVID-19, because it will become part of one of many different kinds of diseases, which over time just become part of, this is the way life is. So that would be what I'd say about that.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating point about how much it quickly becomes normalized as just how funerals are. We're not really sure of the history of why it came about. I wondered if anyone else on the panelist had any inklings of what what they might see as part of the post-pandemic new normal. Louise, yeah.
I think it's really worth mentioning that the UK funeral industry, and I call it an industry because it really very much is an industry here. Sorry, that's the church bells store. It very much is an industry and was under investigation by the Competitions and Markets Authority for exploitation of vulnerable people. And the CMA, as they are known, had written some absolutely amazing reports that were exposing a lot of the industry. And the industry was changing anyway, because a lot of bad practice was being called out, especially funeral directors who profit off selling extras to people. So upgrading coffins, having lots of cars. And actually what COVID has done is what the CMA were trying to do, but the CMA were going to take years to be able to do it. And COVID has done it overnight. So we might see that some of the big funeral companies in the UK don't survive in the next couple of years because their profits have taken such a beating over the last few months, because their models were set up to make money out of selling extras that people no longer can have, and selling funeral plans, which now mostly, if someone had paid for a funeral plan with an expensive coffin and lots of cars, well, those expensive coffins were not available up until only a couple of days ago, because the coffin suppliers were only making very simple coffins. In fact, they went to making only cardboard at one point. And most companies stopped providing limousines. So all of the ways of making profit out of funerals have been changed. And I think there's been a movement in the UK of progressive funeral directors doing things differently and concentrating on the emotional value of the service rather than the hardware for ages. And I think we're going to see more of that, and that becoming even stronger. But also a bit of a kickback from the more conventional funeral directors who are going to be fighting for survival over the coming years, especially because the increased death rate over the last few months has meant that a lot of their future, and to put it really crassly, sorry to do this, but their future customers have already died. And so that's also their future profits eaten into. So I think we're going to see big changes in the kind of funeral directors that will survive this, and also expectations from people who have realised that you don't need to spend thousands and thousands of pounds and have all those extras to have a meaningful funeral. Actually, it can be something really simple, but still really, really beautiful. And I think this might be one of the good things that comes out of COVID, that the work that the CMA were trying to do will have been escalated by this crisis. And those changes, which were so desperately needed, are going to come much quicker than expected.
And just to add to that, Louise, I think that, because families have become so much more invested and involved in putting together funerals because they have been so much smaller, they've done their research, they've had to access stuff online that normally they'd go and, sit down with a funeral director and have that opportunity for the funeral director to perhaps, encourage them to do different things. Whereas, all of it's been done over Zoom or over the phone, and families have kind of known what they've wanted. They've been invested. So yeah, they're now so much more aware of what they want.
And I totally agree with what Stephanie and Louise have said. I think this has really produced a more informed consumer, a consumer that now knows what it takes to put a funeral together, how important family is, how important having that funeral personalised is. And I think this is going to give birth to a really different funeral industry in the next generation to come. And this is exactly what we've been wanting to see for a long time. So definitely lots of positives.
Hannah, can I just jump in here real fast? Yeah. I just want to say that, so everything that Stephanie, Miriam, and Louise are saying completely echoes the conversations I've been having with my dad about funerals and like what, as you know, because I'm stuck here with my parents. So I'm talking about funerals, but like this is exactly what he was saying. Like, although he retired many years ago, that this is what funeral directors will do, and I think that he, and he, I think intuitively understands that good funeral directors, solid funeral directors will figure out how to adapt to go for the personalization that way. And then that's what is, forced by situations. I would also very quickly, I think going forward, one of the bigger issues, because I think funerals will adapt. I actually think one of the big areas, this is slightly outside of the funeralization side of it, but I do think there needs to be a really big rethink on how families spend time with family members who are dying. I think that for me has become one of the big issues. And I've talked a lot about this, that, you know, there are protocol in the books on how to deal with someone who has an immunosuppressive or an compromised condition in hospitals. But that, you know, by and large, one of the reasons families could not spend time with someone who was dying was because of the unavailability of PPE or scarcity to be able to do that. But I will tell you right now that, and as someone my father was hospitalized last December in an ICU after a massive cardiac arrest, died actually at the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, but was resuscitated and then spent another month in rehabilitation. He's fine, miraculously. It makes no medical sense, but he's fine. But you know, my mom and I were with him for every day in the ICU. I mean, he was intubated, he was on a ventilator, everything we hear about. And so I really feel for the families who can't do that. But what I would say is, if you tell a family, in order for you to be with your loved one, you're going to have to put on this PPE to do it, families will do that. Like, families will do that. It will require a hospital, wherever it is, having someone there to help them do that. And so it will require, you know, a workforce to do that. And that's not a minor thing. And I know that. But I think going forward, that's going to have to be, that has to be an issue, because it's affecting how everyone is dying. You know, regardless of the conditions and the way that all funerals are affected. And that, to me, I think is, on the dying side, I think that's crucial to think about that way, in addition to funerals.
I think that's certainly a crucial point on the dying side, which is possibly a whole nother conversation, but certainly with certainly with restrictions on palliative care and aged care visits in Australia, we've had huge problems with that ability to access, I suppose, or be with the dying as well as the dead as well. Right, so that ends the formal question section of the webinar, but we're now going to open it up to questions from our attendees who have been listening to this conversation, and we've got quite a number of them, which is great to hear. So what I'm going to do is I'll ask first Bjorn, perhaps, the member of the Death Tech team who's here online, and then maybe Tammy, to offer us a question that has been brought by the attendees. So Bjorn, do you have a question for the panel or for someone specifically?
Hi everyone, I'll just throw my view on there. We've been monitoring the question and the Q&A in the chat. We want to thank everyone for their questions and contributions, and there's a lot there. We obviously can't get to all of them, although I think in different kinds of ways, many of the questions have been addressed through the conversation, and thank you all to the panelists for their time and contribution. I guess maybe the one that I wanted to pick up on is there's been a lot of kind of talk about celebrating the potential for families to become much more agentive in being sort of agents of decision making and being more empowered in taking control and charge of the ways that they organise funerals and death care and so on. But I think we've had a couple of questions that kind of contradict this from other places, particularly I think around this. There was a question from Bangladesh about the potential of families, the role that families traditionally played in this time of COVID-19 for different authorities and local organisations to step in and take charge of some of those processes. Whilst in others, I think it's from, I think it's probably Norichika? Is that a Japanese question?
That would be, Professor at the University of Tokyo. Thanks for
there you go. Yeah, who's asking also about the kind of implications of potentially of families being forced to choose forms of disposition that maybe they wouldn't have if it's from burial to cremation, for example. So I think this distinction between kind of empowerment and sort of choice versus the kind of stepping in of much more formal and or regulatory or institutional forms of control within this period.
Yeah, would the panelists like to respond to that kind of distinction between control and then being taken out of their hands, as it were?
I think for a lot of families, what COVID did do is it did almost disempower them. Well, this is what we thought initially when a lot of these restrictions quickly came into place. You know, ordinarily the grieving would, some do choose to isolate themselves, socially isolate themselves. Some do choose to distance themselves from others and want to kind of personally mourn. Whereas this forced that upon them. And even when it came to choices of whether it was going to be burial or cremation, this question to the Muslim community here in Australia quite early on, you know, if governments did make it mandatory to cremate bodies of COVID victims, how would that impact the grieving of Muslims? And to be honest, it's actually quite terrifying to even think about it. This is not a mode of disposal that fits within the guidelines of the way we treat the body after death. So that would have been quite a difficult, and I believe in the UK there was talk of an emergency bill that was going to be passed, and I think that both the Jewish and Muslim communities came together and said this would never work for us, and it was repealed. So I think it would have meant a lot of distress and a lot of our community groups if the choice to dispose of the body in a particular way was taken on from a government perspective, and that wasn't allowed for families to have that option. But luckily in Australia, we continued to bury and cremate. The choices were still there and no interference was made.
Yeah, great. And Louise, would you like to respond as well?
Yes, so before we went into lockdown, I think it was, there was a lot of debate of everything becoming cremation only. And I think the Islamic and Jewish communities came together and lobbied the government basically to ensure that the legislation didn't go through to make that the case. And it also became apparent that actually, as John touched on earlier, that it was the living that was more of the problem at funerals than the dead. Once the person who's died is in body bags and in their coffin, the threat is contained. It was the living people attending the funerals that was the problem. But the Coronavirus Act did go through, and that changed everything overnight. One thing it meant was that paperwork became digital. And death registration became digital, so all the paperwork that we would normally have to drive around London delivering, suddenly we could send by email, and families were having death certificates emailed to them. So it all became very efficient overnight. But there was constantly this threat of the local authorities taking over, and I think more commercial funeral directors were really terrified of that. The Coronavirus Act said that if the death management system, which is what it was called, in very crass terms, collapses, then local authorities can take over. And we had to fill in information to say how many private ambulances we had, our mortuary capacity. And what we were supposed to do was report weekly the number of deaths we had, the number of funerals that were booked, the number of people who were in long-term storage, so that the local authorities could keep track of what was going on and whether the system was coping. And the response from funeral directors in London has been really disappointing. There have been emails going out reminding us of our legal obligation to fill in those reports, because even during the peak, only 10 to 15% of London funeral directors were filling in those reports.
Wow.
So what started off as something that people needed to do ended up being something that people became really sensitive of, because a lot of the more commercial funeral directors didn't want people knowing how many funerals they were doing. Like, it all becomes sort of very old school and not collaborative, and all the sort of stuff we're trying to get away from. But the threat is there that if the system cannot cope, the local authorities will take over, and they will take over all of our equipment and all of our mortuaries, and they will do it. And that's, I think, if the death rate was really, really high. And had it been much higher than it was during the peak in London, we would have potentially got into a situation where we needed that. But I've actually been quite proud of the way most funeral directors have coped. And to give you an idea, there's usually one private ambulance team that we work with who are on call 24/7. And during the peak, there were 3 ambulance teams going out 24/7 for about 5 weeks non-stop. So that's, you know, how much the system was pushed to breaking point, but didn't break in the end.
Wow, I'm so glad that you have us on the panel with us to really communicate the kind of the real peak that what happened in London, because I think it's quite difficult for some of us in different locations around the world to understand just how dire and how, you know, how much of a strain that put on the you know, the death care sector. If we can now ask for another question, hopefully Tammy, Tamara Cohn, a number of my team will come on and ask a question from the panel, or from the attendees, sorry.
Hi everyone, this has been fabulous. I've seen a few questions here from Ian Woodruff in Cambridge, Debbie Jones, and also to some extent Dawn Kemp, are all asking something about the grieving process, because while the process of managing numbers is, and it's been alluded to in terms of people's distress at not being present, there have been questions about how this affects the grieving process. whether, as Ian says, it's a parallel about, with death without trace, without being able to say farewell, how friends, colleagues, and neighbors might be enabled better to participate in the death as we know it now, and if there are symptoms that people are starting to see, perhaps, of an interruption to the grieving process. I know it's a bit early days for that, but perhaps people could comment on that. We also, while I'm speaking, and then you can pick what you want to respond to. Sandy Weatherburn spoke of her own funeral for her father in the UK last month, and had to have only 10 people present for 20 minutes. And while it was really meaningful, she felt that it was restricted. Touching the coffin, not touching that coffin was very hard, and technology helped, but it didn't replace that need for touch. How could the panel perhaps think about ways in which substitution to those human actions could be designed for? So it's a bunch of questions, but mostly around emotion, grief, how people might be able to think of ways to involve people on that level.
Thank you, Tammy.
Anybody?
We have someone on the panel who might want to talk about grief. Stephanie, you've got your hand up there.
Well, I don't know that I necessarily want to talk about grief, but I'd just like to make a comment about some of the feedback I've had from families and some of the feelings that I've got from some of the services that I've led. And it seems, with a smaller service, it is more intimate. And I don't know whether it's a function of, and I'm sure it's had a lot to do with the fact that we are still living in a COVID world, in a very different world. But there seem to be some of the celebratory elements taken out of services. From my, perspective, the services that I was doing and have been doing have been more about saying goodbye. They've been more about a farewell. And I really believe, and I really hope, that families will come together when things become easier and do something else. Whether it is, a structured memorial service, I don't think that's really necessary. Whether it's a family reunion in a park, whether it's a big knees up wake, I in the conversations that I've been having with families, they've been looking at the service as their moment of farewell, and hoping that down the track they can bring people together again. And I believe at that time that will be when that life will be celebrated. Whether it's 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is, people will be hopefully will be all in a very different place, different frame of mind, and they can look back and really celebrate the life. So I'm probably a little bit Pollyanna about all of this, and hoping that that's the way people will kind of move forward and come back together.
That's fascinating, though. That's an emergence of a two-stage funeral, perhaps.
Yeah.
A funeral and then a celebration. Yeah. Unless anyone else has got an urgent question, I think we might go to Bjorn, just so that we can rapid fire through a few of these. Bjorn, did you have another question from the attendees?
Okay, sorry, I'm just unmuting myself there.
Sorry,
I'm hammering myself. Is that going to show?
That's all right.
No, that's okay. You don't want to see me anyway. Okay, maybe we'll just hit on the last. I think we've kind of responded to a few of the earlier ones. One has just come in from Greece, from Nikos Kosmidis, who's asked how easy was it for clerics to adapt to the new situation and to collaborate with death care workers and the families of the departed ones. In my country, Greece, the pandemic caused a social and political conflict around the adaptation of church services. This is very much about religious institutions and organisations. Funeral services are held near the graves and not in churches, with only family members in attendance. So I guess we haven't really talked a lot about formal kind of, religious institutional rituals, but perhaps if some of the panel members wanted to talk about that question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the role of religious, or not only services, but also locations being shut down, where other locations in Australia were certainly open. Does anyone on the panel wanted to talk about that?
Yeah, I think for the community, it was very similar. We could no longer perform the funeral prayer, which is a communal prayer, at the mosque. So the funeral prayer actually takes place at the cemetery or just outside the funeral service. So yes, there were a lot of graveside services as opposed to those that would have taken place at the mosque. And that adaptation, I mean, it really wasn't the clergy that needed to, or the imams that needed to adapt to it. It was the families. It was like, well, this was a right for the deceased is to have this service done communally inside the mosque, and now you're making us do it at, we're all standing 4 square meters apart or 1.5 meters apart, and that really just reinforced that sense of isolation. So even though you're there, you're isolated, and a lot of these prayers happen shoulder to shoulder. There's a lot of embracing, there's a lot of handshaking, and that's the way that we to the family of the deceased, and all of that had to stop. So it wasn't just the relocation of it, it was the way that it happened that just reinforced that isolation. And just on the question of grief, I think the entire world was grieving some sort of loss during, whether it was loss of freedom of movement, loss of security, safety, financial security. Everyone was collectively grieving. And then I guess this is a conversation that makes most of us very uncomfortable, but it really pushed it to the fore. And we have, I think, as a result of this, become a little bit more comfortable talking about grief and loss as a society, as a world. And I think that's really something that we should carry forward post-COVID.
Thank you, that's brilliant. We'll just go to Tamara for one last question from the audience.
Okay, so I think that really, what you just said, Miriam, really feeds into a question we had early on, which is, what practices do you expect to persist, or do you hope will persist after the pandemic? So just that moves a little bit beyond just practices around talking about grief, around death and funerals, but also practices that people, and that ties as well with another question that was suggesting that perhaps we'll see a growth in different kinds of memorialization to balance the depletion in other rituals, practices. But could somebody speak to, again, back to the future, I guess, and what we can take away from this?
An excellent question to end us on, actually. Maybe if everyone on the panel can have a little think about one practice that they hope will actually persist beyond all of this, or something, a moment that they think would perhaps come that's a good thing. John?
So one thing I'm hopeful for is, and this might seem a bit of a tangent, but it's not. It's related to the grief and bereavement issue too. And I think that because we're so idiosyncratic as a species in how we deal with grief and bereavement. And I think one of the great problems with so much grief and bereavement theory has been trying to create a kind of like a central unified theory of it, when I think everyone just reacts differently, and we do, and everyone has very different reactions to it. But I think that I'm hopeful for one institutional change, which is, I think, this is going to sound weird, but I'm really hopeful that HR policies around grief and bereavement leave have to change and become much more progressive and liberalized, not just in terms of time off, but paid time off for people that are experiencing grief and bereavement. Because one thing we could see would be a very delayed response to what's going on right now because of the urgency of everything that's happening. So again, we don't know, but I'm hoping that if there's one institutional change that comes out of this, it would be in more the supportive side that people receive in terms of actually being given paid time off for grief and bereavement, or bereavement leave, or whatever that might be, because it's necessary and the right thing to do. And that, I think, is one thing going forward that I would like to see come out of this, in the same way that, other epidemics have created, situations that things became necessary. The example I always use with AIDS is, one of the things that comes out of the AIDS epidemic is the idea that marriage equality or same-sex marriage should be a thing. Like, that had not really been a huge issue until suddenly it became clear that if you didn't have spousal rights, you had no claim to the dead body. Yeah. Or the funeral. And that took 30, 35 years, right? But it was a change that came out of it. So that's why I'm saying I think that there are ways to think about how we can hopefully see different kinds of practices that come out of this.
No, excellent. Where should we go next? Do we have a wish? Louise, do you have a wish for the future?
Yes, I have two. So one is to do with paperwork. It's become so efficient. We used to have endless arguments with crematorium staff about not accepting paperwork digitally, and insisting that we wrote checks for things, and all of that just went out the window overnight. And although some of it is a bit questionable, because when the Coronavirus Act came in, it meant that, for example, 2 doctors didn't have to see the person who had died after death before cremation. So some of it is a bit questionable, but the efficiency of it has made a big difference, because a lot of it was just pointless administration that was wasting everyone's time and really of no benefit. So I really hope that especially crematorium and cemeteries will continue to embrace a new way forward of using technology to facilitate things which just don't need to be printed and signed by paper anymore. And the other thing is the level of engagement we have seen. So particularly during the peak, when in London, when lots of people were facing a bereavement, we were fielding calls from people who never would have called us normally, because they suddenly realised that all funeral directors are not the same, and actually they don't just have to go to the one that's local to them. And people were calling around and asking questions in a way I had never seen before, and finding someone who they liked, who connected with their ideas, and who had an approach that they were okay to go with, even though they were going to have to face some really difficult decisions. And I really hope that that level of engagement from people who are having to arrange a funeral continues, because it will really make some of the more complacent funeral directors have to wake up and adapt to change. It would be really sad if we were just to go back to how things were before, where a lot of people weren't necessarily that engaged in the process and just wanted to get it done as quickly and painlessly as possible. I think the more engaged people are, the better, and we may have to find new ways around that. For example, all of the things that we did around family participation have had to be put on hold, but as creative funeral professionals, I think we can find new ways of helping the people who are engaged in the process to continue to be engaged, because funerals were important and are still important. I think will be important still in the future.
Great, thank you. Maybe Mariam and then Stephanie, a quick
summary. Yeah, just really quickly. I just wish that the fact that COVID brought death, the discussion space, it really is everybody's business. And what I would like to see is that more people become curious about the end of life planning, about what it takes to organize a funeral, what would their funeral look like, what does a good death mean for them, and then they can carry that discussion on, so that when it comes where they either have to arrange it for somebody or it's for themselves, they're a lot more informed on what those options look like for them. So this is what I'd like to see continue.
Brilliant. And Steph, if you would.
Yeah, I have to agree with Miriam and also with Louise. I'd like to see people more invested in funerals and more creative. I just think, I've been so amazed with the different ideas that people have come up with, because they have, put so much thought and effort into the funeral services. So I'd like to see people continue with that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for your contributions this evening or this morning or the middle of the night, as it is for John. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear from you and all your experiences, the different backgrounds and different locations. And thank you all, everyone who's tuned in and added to the conversation. Let's keep it going. Let's keep talking. This video of this webinar will be available on the Death Tech Research Team website, the details of which are on the Eventbrite information and available via Twitter. People can also continue the conversation using the hashtag #COVIDfunerals. There's a number of people discussing this webinar as we speak online, so if you'd like to participate in that conversation, please do. Stephanie also has a podcast known as Dying to Tell, which is available on iTunes and Spotify, and an audio version of this podcast, of this webinar, will be made available in that podcast. And finally, another I suppose, project that the Death Tech Research Team is putting together is a collaborative map of stories of people's experiences of death during Corona. And I put the link for that resource for people in the chat. And if you'd like to go to that resource and to read stories of people's experiences of death and dying during COVID around the world, and maybe to contribute your own story, we'd really welcome you to do so. So there's nothing left for me to do except to thank you all very, very much for your contributions, and to wish you all the best and strength. And thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Hannah.
you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.